Welcome, everybody, to the first episode of a new webinar series from AI Dash, Securing Tomorrow. We started this new series to, I think, broaden the scope from our old State of Vegetation Management series. So we're going to be talking about more than just veg management, although it'll be a significant topic of conversation. We're excited to have Gary Huntley and Bryan Sonnier with us today. I'm Kelly Rupp. I am the product marketer over at AI Dash, responsible for helping gather these great folks and putting these together. We've got a great discussion for you, and I'm looking forward to hearing the insight that Gary and Bryan are going to bring to us today. Thanks again for joining. For just a few housekeeping things, this is being recorded and will be available about a half an hour to us after the webinar. We may do a little bit of editing, just polishing a little bit. So this will be available online for folks if you have to jump out or you want to watch pieces of it again. As far as Q&A goes, down in the bottom menu there is a Q&A box. You can drop questions in there throughout the webinar. You can also raise your hand if you want to ask a question live, and we'll do our best to get to those. So without further ado, I'm going to take a back seat and leave it to Gary and Bryan and the discussion.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelly. I'm Bryan Sonnier. I'm a senior manager in the customer success and transformation organization here at AI Dash. I've been with AI Dash for almost 3 years now. And before that, I was with Oncor Electric out of North Texas for 13 years. I spent about half that time in telecommunications, helping build out the advanced metering infrastructure to pull in all of those meter reads and ensure two-way communication, as that became very critical, just with all the advances in data and technology going on at the utility. Then the second half of my career, I was in distribution operations as an engineer, also spent time in new construction management. And then all the roles that I had, I interfaced a lot with veg crews and just maintenance crews as well. We also have Gary Huntley here today, retired VP of Distribution Services at Entergy. You want to tell everyone just a little bit more about yourself real quick?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Bryan. Good afternoon, everybody. Gary Huntley, Vice President of Distribution Services, retired from Entergy. And when I was in that role, I had several departments reporting to me, vegetation management probably being the one with the most impact to customers, most impact to budgets, and in terms of reliability and system, just overall broad reach. I had at that time 400 employees that spanned across 4 states: Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, and Arkansas. And yeah, I think that I'll pause right there.
And Gary, you're in New Orleans right now, right?
That is correct. I'm currently located in New Orleans, and my last assignment was headquartered out of New Orleans.
Gotcha. Awesome. So you made it through snow a couple weeks ago. What was more exciting, the snow or the Super Bowl?
Boy, I tell you, I think the snow was more excited, and I think it won out over the Super Bowl because even though things were pretty much shut in, we were fortunate enough to not lose power. So my experience wasn't terrible on that, but it was a once in a lifetime event. I think the record said it was the first time in over 100 years we had snow near that level.
Yeah, I had heard that there was more snow than the last 100 years combined, but if there was none, then that makes sense. So we'll be talking a little bit about extreme weather here today. Gary will have quite a few stories to tell along the way, and I may have some things to add here from my perspective on the utility side working in North Texas. We'll start out, Gary. I know that you have a little bit of content, some pictures here around Hurricane Ida. I think that was likely the worst storm that you had to respond to in your time at Entergy. You want to tell us a little bit of the background on preparation for Ida, what you guys saw coming, and then how everything played out over the ensuing days and weeks there?
Yeah, sure, Bryan. Ida, for me, in terms of as an executive and having responsibilities around storm restoration, was the most challenging by far. And I say that because I'll give you a little history. On August 26th, and this is 2021, Ida became a tropical storm. And then within the next day, it became a hurricane. And when it became a hurricane, it became a Category 2 hurricane. And 6 hours later, it was a Category 4 hurricane. And this hurricane developed in the Caribbean, which is, when you think about, certainly for Entergy, the storms that start out in the Atlantic Ocean and developing hurricanes out there, we have a lot more warning track, right? Where we can do a lot more planning. In this case, we didn't really have a lot. So that storm, that tropical storm started August 26th. It was a hurricane on August 27th, and it literally made landfall August 29th. So the clock was ticking extremely fast. I can recall when Hurricane Katrina hit, which was the worst prior to that, that we had a lot more time to really look at it and start making planning. So that's probably one of the worst storms, from not having enough time and really trying to plan for what later became the second most powerful storm to hit the United States in history. I
Wow.
think
Yeah.
the
I'm from
landfall was in
Beaumont.
Fort Fourchon, and the wind speed was at 150 miles an hour when it finally did make landfall.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm from Southeast Texas, from Beaumont, and I remember Katrina and Hurricane Rita, which came straight through between the Texas-Louisiana border. And I didn't remember this with Ida, with it developing that rapidly, that you just didn't have the foresight there. That's adds extra layers to the challenge there for sure.
That's right. And so here, so with that, the previous picture I had showed you the width of the storm, but here, this is just a small snippet of the the distribution lines that just blew over. In fact, we had some pictures where they just snapped like toothpicks. But here you can see how challenging it is just navigating through. And then, as you can imagine, with all this power out, the local communities were just really struggling from that perspective. In addition to that, the transformers went down, and so if some of these streets were impassable, so you have people who can't get back home, check on their homes and businesses, because we did have quite a few people to evacuate. But even from a restoration perspective, it was really challenging to get the trucks in and out of certain areas. And let me just mention, we had some high water vehicles to get through this. In this particular picture, you don't really see that, but we had some areas that, even though they didn't have transformers and poles crossing the street, the water was still high for a period of time, that it just made it challenging for us to move resources in and out.
Yeah, certainly. And when you're talking about transporting, like the number of poles, you're talking about just the amount of equipment, not having clear roads. That's a big challenge. And this is the middle of a like developed road. This isn't some back alleyway or anything either. So those
That's right.
situations, I'm sure that it takes even longer to get there. The restorations are even more complex, and that's just a lot to manage during the event for sure.
That's right. And then this is just an example of one of the transmission structures that the 150-mile-an-hour winds just twisted like a pretzel and just folded it over off of its base. And so you can just imagine just the sheer wind force that it took. So that 150 miles an hour, by the way, is sustained winds, right? Is what they measured. So you've got gusts that probably exceeded 200. For this picture, probably exceeded 200 miles an hour.
Yeah, I think for me, being in North Texas for so long, this is similar to tornadoes that we would see tear through during the summers. Even just throughout the North Texas area, there are straight line winds that come through, and those, the derechos would have 80-mile-an-hour sustained winds. That was pretty common over the
Yeah,
summers. We'd have 100, 200, even 500,000 people out just from those straight line winds. Even if you're away from the Gulf Coast, like there are similar kinds of challenges and events that you're responding to. Dallas was interesting, that DFW area, because we'd have ice storms, we'd have these straight line winds. We got a little bit of everything. We were at the bottom of Tornado Alley. So like the operations piece, like you always had to be on your toes, right? Because
that's
all
right.
throughout the year, there was always something that was a threat weather-wise that you always had to be ready to respond to. That transmission structure is just unbelievable, though.
Yeah, and this is just another example of that, right? Just how it's just not just knocked over, but just twisted. Those winds can do the things that you just described, right? It's just devastating.
Yeah. Other than just the scope of all the damage here, what do you think the biggest challenges were in just working through a response and getting lights back on?
There's quite a few that, and initially you just want to know what you're dealing with, right? The storm passes, you're trying to get in, you want to know where the poles are down, you want to know if you've got damage to other structures on transmission and distribution and even generation, right? You just want to know that, but you got to figure out, can I get in there, right? Where can I go? And so when you have a storm like this that damages over 30,000 distribution poles, 6,000 transformers, 30,000 spans of distribution wire, and then you see the substations and these other structures. it's daunting, right? And so for Ida, all this happened in a relatively small geographic area. Like we're talking about Southeast Louisiana, right? And just south of I-10, and then just the eastern portion of the state is just not a very large area, but you do have quite large, relatively large populations. So most of when you think about the almost 1 million outages that we had, Louisiana as a whole has about 3 million in terms of population, right? And so you can see that a large concentration of the population is in the area that we're talking about.
Yeah, we saw similar challenges with a lot of customers of the utilities that we work with in Florida, Georgia, even up into the Carolinas from Hurricane Helene. And we worked with one utility that literally almost every single customer was out. And then I think it was a week or maybe two later, Milton came through across the middle of Florida and hit some of those exact same utilities. So that preparation, man, it's hard to describe, how almost demoralizing it is. Like when you get all those lights back on and you have something else come through. In this case, I don't even know how you found 30,000 poles and how you found all the equipment to get everybody restored. And that just normal inventory is probably not going to cover something like that, right?
That's right. And again, keep in mind the amount of time we had to plan and try to move those resources was really short, right?
Yeah, you had equipment coming in from all over the country as well. Like mutual assistance wasn't just crews. I'd guess that there's all kinds of material and everything else that's coming in.
No, you're absolutely right. We had, in addition to the 27,000 workers that came from 41 states, just saying those words just still brings me right back to just how much coordination took place. But you had utilities that were literally lending us equipment so that we can get these back up and going.
Yeah, sure. Let's talk just a little bit more about like cases like this where you have mutual assistance and you have a lot of crews coming from off system that aren't familiar with your territory. They're not as familiar with your construction standards. They're not familiar with the applications that you're using for your work management. I know the utility that I was with, when we would have mutual assistance crews come on, there was a separate mobile app that they would use that we didn't use internally. And I found that to be really common working with other customers, that you get crews from off system and they're working in some app or other platform that I'm not in day to day. And I'm finding that when they come in, they say, hey, like we're ready, like we're at the staging area. It takes another like 4 to 6 hours just to get those guys up and running on the app instead of having one shared platform that everyone can access. So just that was important to me coming from the technology side of things. Just thinking, man, like we're losing so much efficiency here because we don't have a single application or a single platform to assess what's going on and where I need people to go and just make sure that they're working safely there as well. So I don't know, was that similar with Entergy?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And so I think about it as in terms of these resources, these mutual assistant resources coming from 41 states. They all have their own safety program. Now they all of them will have some similar components, right? But they do things differently to some degree, not wrong, not good or bad, but just different. And so it's almost akin to having people coming in that speak different languages, and then you have an interpreter that says, okay, this is your standard, but these are ours, and you're just trying to make sure that that in the translation and what they need to do, that it still works and it still works, most importantly, safely, right? And so, and by the way, we do have the language barrier as well, right? So we actually do have people who speak other languages that come in. And so we do deal with that to some degree as well. You mentioned something about systems, and that has been a real big challenge. I'll tell you, getting things up and running. So the logistical part of a storm, you have to get out and figure out what you have. And so before you can set up a staging site and get through all of that, you need to know, can the crews get in and out? Are the roads clear of water, clear of debris, clear of structural issues or what have you. And then that logistic site, that staging site has to be set up. And so what we found was in several cases, we didn't have internet, right? Not yet, because they lost power. The telecom people lost power. And so our people were really working off of a generator that then they communicated mainly through their cell phone. So you go from having access to systems to really making phone calls and sending emails. And so that really hinders you from a time perspective. So you'll hear me talk about time because time is of the essence when it comes to restoration. But so to your point, you mentioned one example of safety, the systems that you use. We had a separate system that we used for managing resources. How do we track the number of the types and the number of resources and where they are? You're trying to keep count of 27,000 people and in a pretty tight geographic area, and you don't have the internet's not up and running. You're literally making phone calls. You and your team are making phone calls, and somebody's trying to coordinate that and put it in a spreadsheet and send it out. And so it gets challenging, right? It gets to be challenging. And this thing is very dynamic. People are trying to provide you with information in real time for you to act upon, but you can only act as quickly as the information can be processed and a work plan can be developed.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I've thought about that a lot as well, coming from a world. I entered the utility space right when there was a lot of transition towards technology and centralizing data and information. Communicating devices were starting to become more and more prevalent on the grid. And there was a big shift. There was a paradigm shift around manual processes and just data coming in slowly compared to what we frequently see now, where you know exactly where the outages are. You might not know the extent of the damage, but you're better able to prioritize your response and plan those resources more effectively, like you're talking about. Now, still, it's a challenge with 27,000 people. Never
That's
had a
right.
situation like that. Like, well, leading damage assessment, something that I had to go through and try to manage. But certainly, there's still a lot of spreadsheets. There's seems to be a lot of uncertainty around where do we go first? What do we get done? How do you go through that? Or how do you think through as an executive, what areas do you need to work on first? Because the goal is to get all the lights back on, right? But how do
That's
you
right.
go through that process of where to even start?
Yeah, for us, it was always about safety is always the number one priority. And then you have a process for how do you things that you have to get started and to get power back on safely. And so you have to be able to, so as much as we think about getting the crews out and having them to start removing and replacing poles and wires and that sort of thing, that the truth of the matter is these people have to have a place to sleep, to have food. So the staging site has to be set up so that when you bring them in, they can function, right? They can go out and work. And at that stage and site, we also give them the training that you discussed. For me as an executive, it's really about you've got to keep your eye on the prize in terms of what are the priorities. And so at the end of the day, everybody wants the lights back on, but the best way to do that safely and systematically, you have to start with that, right? And so you've got to have a place to set up camp, so to speak. And then from there, you have to have your scouting, right? You've got to get the information. Where's the damage? And what do I need to address that? That scouting. So speaking of one of the frustrations, a lot of that from a historical perspective is manual. You send people out in trucks. We would fly helicopters to see the oversight of the transmission structures and then some of the distribution and then even have people at the plants to give their assessment of what the generation facilities look like. And so you can imagine all of this information on 30,000 poles, on 36,000 spans of wire, et cetera. All that information you're trying to collect as soon as possible, and you don't have internet in some of the places, right? And then you're still trying to funnel that information up through the organization. So as an executive, it was very frustrating in terms of the time that it took, and hours felt like days. They really did. And days felt like weeks. And so for customers, it's really life changing for every hour, for every day that they can't get back to their house. And think about it from a business perspective. You're a small business, and every day of revenue that you don't have really could hinge upon your survival as a small business, right? And so as an executive, you have all that in mind, and you weigh all that as you try to work things systematically to get power restored.
Yeah, and I can't tell you the number of times that I went out with paper maps to mark up where damage was. And I just thought, man, I just need an app or something that I could use offline and then come back and sync my data later. I feel like in the market now, there are some different solutions for that. I know we have one on the AirDash side as well, but there have been a lot of improvements. in that area over the last few years as well, with just what do you do when you don't have that communication on the back end? Because ultimately, like when I go out with a paper map and I'm marking up all the damage, somebody still has to transcribe that back in the GIS or actually enter work orders based off of that information anyway. So I'm just creating another link in the chain where something could go wrong or be entered incorrectly, and that just prolongs some of that restoration activity, like you're talking about with customers that this is important, like they are missing out on revenue, and it's not just homes; those businesses need lights back on as well. So the community impact can be severe in cases like this for sure.
Yeah, and Brian, one thing I want to add, so you brought up a really good point, and I just want to expound on it just very briefly. That human interaction, that collecting of data that you just mentioned, by example of the maps, just we think about the information that we collect, but then the processing of that information. The faster that you can make a decision that says, this particular highway is closed, we had plans to move 3,000 resources south on this particular highway, that's not available. How do we now redispatch? Where do we move that? And if you had a system that said, I know where all the open roads are, and if you just close off one of these, I know how to redirect all those resources, and I know where the staging site is, and I can bring that. A system could do that in fraction of a second. I won't even tell you how long it took for us to be able to get that information, because we don't have the email is not working in some areas, and you have to do it by phone, and it just could take such hours could be wasted or lost, not wasted but lost, just trying to get that. So, for example, collecting information is one thing, and I'll expound on that a little bit later too. But that the ability to process that information and make meaningful and impactful decisions around restoration is really game changing.
Yep. I wanted to follow that up with just one thing. So you're trying to make the right decision, but then you got a lot of other distractions coming in. You've got a social media post about some favoritism. Oh, the CEO lives over there, so his lights are back on, or you're getting the mayor restored first, things like that. What other distractions do you see that just seem to hinder that? Like either just your mental ability to respond or just actually get in the way of being able to get lights back on?
Yeah, so I know this is going to sound weird, but one of the biggest distractions is reports. So you have people that it's one thing to pass information on, and some of the reports are needed, right? You need information that you have to disseminate to the people who are doing the restoration. But then you also have to balance that with you'll get requests for information and reports that need to go out to like the public information officer, right? How do you communicate to our customers and our communities what's going on? Where are we? What can they expect from restoration times? Where can they go to get resources? So you have that, but then you also have somewhere in the middle, you've got these other reports, information people would like to have. And I'm not saying that it's not important at some level, but it's the balance of where you can spend hours working on all these reports, these requests for information, but you've got to prioritize them so that you can get the work product out, right? You can give the work plans out to the hands of the people that have to get it done, and then you find a way to try to deal with some of these others. That is probably the most, that can bog you down the most. And as the chain of command matters, right? And so I felt I was fortunate to be where I was in the chain of command, that I could destruct some of what I thought was not necessary reports, right, for the groups, and they can just get the information later when we did the evening follow-ups. But it's hard to tell people they have to wait on information, but when you in that role of responsibility and you know where the priorities lie, you sometimes you have to bite the bullet, as they say.
Yep, for sure. Between just all the information coming in, all those distractions on like the social side of things, technology can be a double-edged sword. So it's more about just how do I use all this coming in as efficiently and effectively as possible. So let's talk a little bit about AI Dash and the solution that we have here. And then we'll go through a couple of real examples of how we're helping utilities operate in some of these scenarios. We have a product that we've developed that's our climate risk intelligence system. We love acronyms like normal utility guys do, so we'll call this CRIS. So when we look at Dash, just as a whole, we've been around for over 5 years now. Typically, so we started in the remote sensing space with satellite imagery and running analytics for the utility says, here's where my poles and wires are at. And we say, here's where the trees are based on new imagery. Here's what those risks are for grow in or where you need to do hot spotting. Here's where the fall in risks are. So we have a lot of practice with this. We've worked with over 130 utilities now and processed over 1 million line miles of data all across North America and really the world. We have customers in New Zealand and a lot of other fun places that we get to go visit. But a lot of them face the same types of problems, right? So we started with this vegetation management platform to leverage new imagery to show them where those risks are and then help prioritize addressing those risks specifically with veg, because that is the largest line item in an O&M budget for a utility typically. We realized once we had that imagery and we had that vegetation data, there's a lot more that we can do with that. So the next product that we started working on is this climate risk intelligence system, CRIS. So we can take those vegetation conditions, then we can pair that with real-time weather data and different asset information that the utility has to say, we know that a storm's coming. We can look historically and say, what other storms is this most similar to? And then we can predict what those incidents and outages might look like so that you can more properly prepare on the front end at 3 days before the storm. So Gary, you had mentioned that. One of the most challenging things is just that initial assessment of how bad is it? So if you have a leg up on that and you already know, okay, I'm expecting 200 outages from this storm based on current wind speed and direction, lightning, and other kind of factors there, that's really helpful as part of that initial planning process. So Chris, we'll talk about a little bit more here. The other thing that we realized is if we pull in even more asset data, then we can help with inspection processes. We can help with hardening projects, identifying where risks are to different types of assets, and come up with a process to plan for doing some hardening or replacement as well. So we have an asset inspection management system as well that's AIMS, that all of these work across different facets of the utility space. So we'll have that AIMS piece that I just talked about that's more helping with assets that are deployed in the field. We have CRIS, which is more that situational awareness piece for storm and for wildfire. And then we have that work management piece with the IVMS, where we can take photos, we can see who work is assigned to, we can see what's going on in the system. So this really is a comprehensive approach that we've developed over the last 5 years working with a lot of utilities. And then we'll look closer at CRIS, but before we do that, Gary, I don't know if you had anything else to add around just platform and products that we have here.
Yeah, so Bryan, thank you. And I appreciate you going over that summary. When I think back on my experience with IDA, I can't help but to think, man, if I had something like this with a single access point where I had access to all this information, where others could go and pull and run reports. I didn't have to necessarily, if you had a mobile app where I have phone service, but we don't yet have the staging site, doesn't have the internet capabilities, right? I'm just using phone data. It would just have made life a whole lot easier. And I probably could have saved hours per day on working through work prioritization for Hurricane Ida.
Sure. Yeah. And when you save hours, that adds up because time is money, right? Both for you and for the customers that you're serving. That's important. We know with weather getting more severe on both extremes, right? Like we see more of these ice storms. We're seeing New Orleans with 6 to 9 inches of snow. Then over the summer, we're seeing hotter weather with transformers that are popping all over the place due to just those sustained high temperatures all the time. The storms themselves are causing more damage than they ever have. So being better prepared for this, being able to respond more quickly has benefits all through the utility itself and then to the customers that you're serving. What we found is that about 85%, 80 to 85% of storm outages are caused by trees. And because with our IVMS platform, we have that satellite imagery or other kinds of remote sensing data around where the tree risk is, then it's just a small step to say, here's where those risks are, and here's how this upcoming weather will impact those trees and those areas so that you can plan more appropriately. We've also found with IVMS that if utilities proactively plan around those veg risks and the actual condition, then you can reduce outages during storm by about 40%. What I always found working on the utility side is that the bottleneck was almost always getting the down trees off the lines. There were always enough crews to do all the rebuild work. There were crews that could pick up conductor, but there were just not enough chainsaws to go around to chop trees up and pull those out. If you can proactively be working to reduce storm impact of trees specifically, then you're going a long way towards minimizing the overall duration and restoration times for customers as well. Is that something that resonates with you, Gary?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And what comes to my mind in this is there are two areas around this, right? There's inside of the right of way and there's outside of the right of way, right? And I think we found that from a utility perspective, certainly at Entergy, is that if you can manage both, then your probability of mitigating the outages as you just described is increased.
Sure. Yeah. And with the analysis that we're doing on the AIDASH side, we are looking at trees not just within the right of way, but typically 100 feet on either side. And that's so we can capture some of those really tall trees. So if there's any kind of falling risk, we're identifying that ahead of time for you. So on the Chris side, I'd mentioned pulling in weather data. There are multiple sources that we're looking at. I know some utilities use multiple weather models. Some just look at weather.com and say, here's the expected forecast in my area. But again, because you don't know how that specific storm could impact your specific assets, you're left with a lot of guesswork on the preparation side. So when the utility shares with us the age of those assets, the condition of them, any kind of historical information, along with the historical storms, we're able to better help prepare and plan for modeling the impact of that storm itself. Let me show you what that looks like here. So this is taken from our website. If you go to the AIDASH site and look at our products, we have a section on CRIS. And this is very similar to what we deploy for utilities that work with us on these CRIS deployments. So towards the top here, we have a forecast where we're looking at today, and then I can look 6 hours out, 12 hours out, up to 72 hours out to see how the storm might be impacting my territory. For each of those timeframes, I can look at the projected count of events or incidents, both on the high, medium, and low range, because again, we're using multiple models, so we can take the most severe weather estimate and then run that through the predictions and generate a higher end count of those incidents. We can do the same thing with the forecasts that are showing less severity or less impact. To give you an idea of, we don't know exactly how many outages or events you'll have, but it's most likely in this range, and we can do that very reliably. The other thing that we can do is split this network into different districts or regions. When working with customers, we found that almost all utilities are segmenting their network geographically, either by region, by territory. So you can see when different parts of your network will be most impacted and when those peak times are expected to pass through each area of your network. So that helps. Again, Gary, you were talking about staging resources earlier and knowing where they should be. This helps build that plan, because if this is coming in from the north, here's the substation that's likely to have the most impact. If it's coming in from the west, then here's the area that's most likely to be most affected. So you can get those crews to the right place at the right time in that initial prep, instead of waiting until the day after when you have daylight and you're saying, okay, what's the damage and where do all my crews need to be?
That's right. And Bryan, I think there was a question about the granularity of the data. that I think you can respond to quickly. Just
Yeah,
how
sure.
yeah.
I do see that. There's a lot going on a couple of screens here, but how granular does the data get? For example, does AI have the ability to say there are 100 poles in this square mile, 40 of them concrete and 60 are wood? Short answer is yes. We're looking at every single asset that's in the area. And of course, those concrete poles are not going to bend or break like those wood poles. So we're looking at, for each specific pole, the different attributes that they have, and then pairing that with the location of the asset itself plus the incoming weather data. So we can model that very granularly. Normally, we're providing these insights at a feeder level. We can also segment that further down and use other protective devices like reclosers or fuses as well if you want to estimate the impact further down the line. But sure, that's a long way of saying yes. Short answer, yes, we can do that at a very granular level on top of what you're seeing here for the full network. So good question, Chris. All right, I don't want to get into too much of the product here itself because this isn't particularly a product demonstration. So let's talk a little bit more about the development of the CRIS product itself. The first customer that we worked with on developing this was Avista. That was a couple of years ago. Avista was looking at all of the insights that they had from the vegetation management platform through IVMS with us. And they said, we do have this. We know the current veg condition based on all the satellite imagery. Could you guys, hey, AIDASH, could you use weather data to model what the outages might look like? And we said, well, that's an interesting problem to solve, and we think we could do that. Do you have enough historical information? And they said, we have 15 years of storm data, the outage events. So if that's enough to model, then yeah, and I think we can get that done. So Avista had a couple of interesting pain points. One, like we're talking about, not all utilities use multiple models or try to tie those models to estimate the impact of that storm on their network. Avista just had one person that was using a single source forecast, and really it was just a gut check every storm that would come in with, here's about how bad we think this is going to be, but there was no real methodology behind it. There wasn't any kind of real hard science behind it. So that was problem number one, just not being able to do those predictions reliably or consistently. Then the second problem that Avista had was customer feedback was coming in saying, we feel like storm response isn't as efficient or as quick as it should be. We also feel like there's not much proactive communication on what might be happening before the storm comes in or what to expect once my lights are off, right? And this is a separate problem, but a lot of utilities, as part of their outage management, are now doing like mass messaging, texting, and emailing customers saying there's a storm coming in your area, just prepare for whatever that kind of storm is. And then once lights are out, utilities are doing a better job of pushing out those estimated restoration times to customers as well. So we've seen that landscape change a lot in the last few years, just again, from the technology side, integrating better with that, with what customers are expecting and what they want. But at this time, a couple of years ago, Avista just didn't have a process for messaging those customers in advance and didn't have a process for communicating how those restoration efforts were going. So working with Avista, we developed the CRIS application. And what they're seeing is from several events that went through during the development of the product. And since then, we have about a 90%, 92% here on the slide accuracy in estimating the number of incidents for storms. And then those impact predictions themselves are also sitting with high accuracy at 80% or better. We talked about that look ahead window where within 3 days before the storm, you start getting those alerts. So the way this is configured for Avista, they don't need to be in the CRIS application itself, but when there is an event that triggers, that crosses a certain threshold for incident or customer impact, there's a distribution list that gets an email and it says, hey, we're expecting the storm to pass through this district, starting at this time, peaking at this time, and ending at this time, and here's the estimated impact. So that 72-hour window is very helpful just through that planning lens and through the customer communication lens, just to be better prepared for the response here. So that's a very quick background on the history of the development and then some of the benefits that Avista is seeing. Again, I'd mentioned that we have customers in Florida, then all the way up the East Coast that had impacts from Helene, even just through using IVMS, but then for some IVMS plus CRIS, being able to better plan their response, perform those damage assessments, and then have crews in the right place at the right time to do all of that restoration work itself. Gary, anything else that you wanted to add here? I feel like that was a lot from my side.
No, I think the Avista has a experience that's similar to certainly what Entergy had, right? And so I think that's going to be more the same for other utilities who've already gone down this path.
I think that's all the content that we have here. So if anybody has other questions, I think we can unmute you and let you ask if we want to chat live, or you're welcome to just drop a question in the chat as well.
Bryan, while we're waiting, let me just say, when I think through this, and I mentioned earlier about some of the things that would have been helpful for me, but I just want to reemphasize just the ability, we think about a lot of this as having a repository for collection of data and for other people to be able to access the platform. And that was a huge benefit that I wish I had. But the other piece of that is just really the AI part of it, the machine learning part of it, right? Where this information comes in, the information gets processed. And then the example I gave about being able to reroute resources if a road is blocked, but just it goes way deeper than that, right? There's just a lot of other things that decisions you could make through the platform that would have been time sensitive. And you talked about, we made some analogies about how every minute, every hour counts, but it really could shave days off of a very large restoration. And it could just be, when you think about the millions and millions of dollars per day that utilities spend, that could be daunting. So Entergy's total restoration efforts for Ida were at over $2 billion, right? And that money gets recovered, obviously, through customers in some shape, form, or fashion. And so when you can save millions and millions of dollars off of that by saving days, it really can be, in fact, impactful.
Sure. We did have one other question that came in here. Do you offer modeling for ice events? I don't know if that's one that we've worked through with a utility yet, but if the data is there, so some utilities do have cause codes for ice or snow or other winter related issues. If the data is there, then yes, we can model that. We could model the extra weight on the line from ice or snow or anything else there. We could also, the same way that we're doing that for wind and saying this pole is this old, so it's likely lost a certain amount of structural integrity. So that wind is going to place a certain bending moment on the pole if the wind comes from this direction. We can do the same kind of calculations with ice. That would be a good thing to follow up with. Anybody on the call here can send me a note anytime and I can forward that along to the product team or guys that are smarter than me. But you can email me if you want. I'm just Bryan, Bryan @ai-.com. I think you can also email hello@ai-.com. And we can get somebody to respond with more specific info there. We can wait for questions here another minute or two if we want, but looks like we might have Kelly back.
Yeah, looks like we've still got basically everybody who started with us is still on. Like I said, like Bryan said, if anybody has any burning questions that you want us to answer now in the next few minutes, go ahead and toss them in the chat or in the Q&A box. Otherwise, I just want to say thank you, Bryan and Gary, for a great discussion. Super insightful. I always learn something during these, and I'm looking forward to the next one as well. We will be running these once or twice a quarter. And like I said, I think our goal here is to cover the sort of the burning topics that I think our customers want to hear about. And we'll have a rotating selection of guests and hosts as well, but expect to see these two faces probably pretty regularly on these, whether they like it or not. That's all I've got. That's all we've got. Thank everybody
Kelly,
for taking the time. Yeah, Gary.
Kelly, one more thing. And so I think one of the last things you mentioned, we're trying to do this, right? Obviously to meet the needs of of customers, potential customers, and just really importantly to educate in the industry. I think if folks have, questions or just would like to see something specifically, they can contact you in the manner that you had, and whether or not if it warrants us a separate topic that Bryan and I could cover, certainly we'll work on that. But if it's something very specific, even to their utility, that's something else that we could just figure out a better way to, maybe it's just a demo or just a separate, shorter conversation. I think we'd be happy to do that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great point, Gary. All right. That's it. That's it for episode 1. It's the Securing Tomorrow series. Like I said, thank you everyone for joining. This is recorded. We'll have it on our website. We'll probably post this to LinkedIn as well. And we can always send it out by email afterwards as well. Yeah, thanks again. And looking forward to the next one.
Thanks, Kelly. Appreciate it. Thanks, Bryan.
Bye.
Thanks, y'all.